Last week, we were introduced to the book of Joshua, establishing Joshua as the successor to Moses, with a promise of God that he, God, would be with Joshua just as he had been with Moses. And we also saw the story of Rahab and how she came to believe in the God of Israel. She asked for mercy from God, and she received mercy from God. Today, we're going to finish with the conquest of Jericho and talk some about the faith of Rahab. Now, before we get into the actual conquest of the city of Jericho, I'm going to, and the Bible Project video talked about this too, but I want to address that criticism that many people have about the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. That criticism is about all of the violence and the killing that takes place in the pages of the Bible. The criticism generally is, as it said in the video, that Jesus never would have done anything like this and never would have condoned such behavior. Jesus says that we're to love our enemies. And so the answer to the criticism, at least in the Bible Project video, was that when they used the word destroy completely, that was a hyperbolic statement, and that this was a specific time and a specific place for a specific reason. It wasn't a general command of some kind. What's your thought? What's your thought? Have you thought about the fact that there were a lot of people killed here? There were women that were killed and children that were killed and so on. Have you thought about how that fits in with the Bible narrative?
Well, if you look at the overall plan, it does. He had to clean it up, the promised land, because the Canaanites were, as pointed out, into child sacrifice, all forms of evil. And if we go before that, he destroyed the world for those reasons, basically, before in the flood. And these, he had promised the Israelites the promised land, but he couldn't give it to them in that condition. He had to straighten things out, I think, and get everything going right. So you had to do something. I mean, you couldn't move them in there and then disseminate into the Canaanite culture, I would say. So.
Yeah, and it's not like Israel was the perfect group of people either, but
they're going to be tempted to.
But there would be temptations there, sure. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
God brings us into this world. He has the right to take us out. Right?
Well, Ann, really, I think you're correct. I have always thought that, people say that God is being, I'm going to turn just a little bit this way, that God is being unfair at times with these people or that person or whatever. And God created this thing, and he made all of us and everything that's a part of the creation. And, he can kind of do with it what he wants to. It's kind of like when you own a piece of property, if the city or county isn't too far into what's going on with zoning and so on, you can pretty much do what you want to with it. If you don't owe money on it, everything's free and clear. If your house is free and clear, you're free to tear it down if you want to. It's something that you have that choice because you own it. It's yours. And as far as I'm concerned, this is God's. And that doesn't sound fair to us, but I don't think God's concerned with fair. I think he's concerned with his will and with how he wants things to be. Yeah, I agree. We have a hard time understanding that. It's tough to figure that out for us. What else? Anybody else? We don't have very many in the class today. We've got 8 in the class today. Yeah, this is one of those things that people will always discuss. People who are generally anti-Bible will bring this up, this stuff in Joshua that goes on, and in Judges as far as that goes. But I think people fail to see the overall story that's going on here.
But if you don't believe that God created us and everything, I can see why.
Right.
But if you believe that He's in control and He can do whatever He wants with us, especially if we don't obey.
Yeah. Well, when we criticize this kind of thing, we don't see the point of view of the Old Testament and of God. We talked about that. Genesis 15, God tells Abraham that his descendants would not inherit the promised land right away, but rather they would do so later than Genesis 15, because as God says, the wickedness of the Amorite, which is one of the people in Canaan, is not yet complete. He is waiting until, evidently he knew what was going to happen, but he was waiting until their wickedness was complete, whatever that means, before they would inherit the land.
Probably made a difference. I don't think he intended, the original intent to keep the people in the desert after the leaving of Egypt 40 years. That was caused by their unfaithfulness, and so they had to get a generation gone, and that's going to change things in the promised land, probably, I'm guessing.
But the 40 years also was, I think, good for them as well, because they learned about, they had to kind of relearn about God. In Egypt, I think they had kind of lost track of God, of the God of Abraham. And they had to relearn through Moses, through Aaron, through the Ten Commandments and so on. So in a way, that was good for them. Well, that wickedness of the Amorite that God talked about, that's well known. The video talked about that. Archaeological discoveries have also shown that. Canaanite religious practices included worship to many gods, child sacrifice, idolatry, religious prostitution, divination, other assorted sinful practices. And the Old Testament, again, the video talked about this. Leviticus 18, Deuteronomy 18, and other passages talk about the sins of these people that live in this particular land. Just one passage, there's one in Deuteronomy. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or a spiritualist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Because of these same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. Evidently, God was very patient with these people. He waited some 400 years. I think even knowing that they weren't going to repent as a group of people, even in the days of Abraham, God's timing is God's timing, not our timing. Israel's not supposed to assume that they are somehow or another the righteous people and they're deserving of the promised land. God specifically tells Israel that those nations are being driven out not because of Israel's goodness, but rather because of the wickedness of the other nations. When we get to the end of the book of Joshua, in the last chapter, Joshua in his final speech is going to tell Israel to get rid of the gods that they took out of Egypt with them, which I think is just really, really telling, because for 40 years in the wilderness, they had those gods with them. They carried them with them across the Jordan River. They were with them when they conquered the land. And at the end of Joshua's life, he's still trying to tell them, get rid of those gods. Israel was not the righteous nation that we sometimes think it was. Deuteronomy chapter 9, I'm going to read this. This is Moses talking to the people. After the Lord your God has driven them, that is the Canaanites, out from before you, don't say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going in to take possession of their land, but rather on account of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Understand then that it's not because, this is the third time he said this, it's not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people. Now that was Moses talking to them some time ago. And Moses goes on in this passage to remind the people about the golden calf, the rebellion of the people after the 10 spies brought back a bad report on the land, and other incidents of Israel's unfaithfulness. It's very plain that God, through Moses, was reminding the people of their own sinfulness and their own unworthiness to take the promised land. It was only by God's grace that they would receive the land. And I immediately came forward to today. It's only by God's grace that we have been given the things that we have. We are not deserving of these things. And of all of the lessons that we have to learn, how tough is that for us? To learn or to know or to truly understand that it's not by what we do. It's not by who we are. It's because God is gracious in giving these things to us.
You know, Jay, we talk about the destruction that God does here on the land of Canaan, but you go over into Kings and Chronicles, and what happens to God's people? Quote, God's, to the nations of Israel, as they're captured and destroyed and carried off into captivity.
Yeah.
This isn't something that God just throws out there and says, I'm going to wipe out the Canaanites. Because it's not too far down in history that it's the children of Israel. Now, the nation is never totally destroyed, but there is a lot of destruction that comes from the Assyrians and the Babylonians upon the nation of Israel because of their wickedness. So it's the wickedness that God is destroying, not, it's the people, but it's the wickedness that's causing the people.
It's amazing that they had almost direct contact with God, and yet that just kept on doing the idols thing. Even Solomon couldn't get rid of everything.
Right.
What was that pole he had or something that he kept that but got rid of Baal and all
Yeah.
the rest? And
Yeah.
so he, they just couldn't shake it. They couldn't follow God and remain faithful to him.
Which kind of brings me to the point of what Curtis was talking about with the suffering part. When things are going really well, when things are going good for us, we tend to put God in the background? And it's when the suffering comes, it's when things don't go well, it's when we're hurting, it's when we lose a loved one, it's when whatever, that look at us as a nation over the past years. What happened after 9/11 in terms of the nation itself coming back in a way, many people, to God in whatever way they did that? What happened after some of these awful shootings at schools and whatever? The people that were there and the greater nation at times came back in prayer and so on. You know, but when things are going real well, you don't see much of that, or apparently you don't see much of that. So I have to wonder whether one of the purposes of suffering is to bring us back to an acknowledgement of God's grace and God's mercy toward us.
In nearly 2 years, and I can't see we're any closer to doing His will. As a nation, it seems like too many people look to politicians for their answers instead of God. In fact, sadly, I've come to the realization that our country is a godless country. And I just wonder how long He's going to put up with us.
I'm not sure exactly, Ann, what you mean by a godless country. Can you talk about that?
How many people don't even acknowledge there's a God, won't allow you to even say God, won't allow you to do prayers? It's just like that's against our Constitution to bring God into anything. That we have to look to other leaders instead of our leader.
Well, one problem too is we hear too much about the bad and not much about the good. And there's a lot of good out there that
Very
we
little do
don't
we
hear
hear.
about.
Yeah, very
And it
little.
goes on every day, and once in a while you hear about somebody doing something, you know, it kind of surprises you, because our press media, and they want this other stuff. Talk about that.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit off the subject here, but that's okay. I hear what you're saying. It is harder than it used to be to bring God into the public sphere without criticism of some kind. I'm old enough to remember the 1950s when, when I was in school and I'd take my lunch to school, the teacher would have us all say a prayer. And I think the prayer was, God is great, God is good, let us thank Him for this food, amen. Well, you don't do that anymore. That's not something that you do. So I get it. I also get what Mike is saying in terms of the good that people do that nobody knows anything about. And maybe that is in a way as it should be, Mike, because if we do good in order for other people to notice, so I get that too. And yes, there is a lot of good that goes on. I've been one of the cheerleaders for help for the homeless and so on here at Riverwalk, and I know some of the people that work on the street and so on, and it just amazes me sometimes the number of people that are concerned enough about that issue along with other societal ills just in the Wichita area that are actually out doing something about it, and we don't hear about a lot of that. There are some national news, the 530 network news, CBS, ABC, NBC, usually has some kind of a good news segment at least once or twice a week. CBS has an on-the-road segment every Friday evening at 5:30 at the end. I love those segments. I've been watching online. There's some guy up in eastern Idaho, up in the Idaho Falls area, giving away $1 million this year to deserving people, anonymously, through the East Idaho News crew and department. And they don't televise it, but they record it. He insists on being anonymous, and these are people that are vetted. These are people that are nominated, they're vetted, they're looked into as, whether the story's a fake or not and that kind of thing. And these are people that are truly in need that this guy is blessing anonymously. He's been doing this for the past 5 or 6 years, every Christmas season. Nobody knows who he is except somebody in the East Idaho News Crew, and they're not telling. And but you don't have to give away $1 million in order to do good. You know, Dean may have $1 million under his mattress, but you don't have to give that away in order to do good. You can do good.
What you said earlier too about big bad things happening, tying people together and forgetting their politics for a while. We went out to a wedding in the New York area about a year after 9/11. And we actually stayed a couple of nights in Manhattan, which I would not have done a year before that, before 9/11.
Okay.
And yet, when we were there, you know, we took a bus tour and set up on.
Right.
And they got all that. They could not be friendlier. I mean, people would stop you in the street, they, you know, that if they knew we were out of town, and we were pretty obvious after a while, and help you, you know. The image of New York was completely different for a while than it was before. And they just, like I say, after a Pearl Harbor type of thing, people will come back to reality for a time and realize that, hey, we're not really different. We need to unite and do this thing, you know, come out of this.
And I don't want to get political here, particularly with the COVID thing, but it's time, you know, that was politicized by people. And I'm not going to point fingers at any one particular ideology or any one particular group. That just got a life of its own throughout society. Whether you're for or against, up, down, sideways, right, left, doesn't matter. It just got picked up and just got so much of a life of its own that you just can't avoid that anymore, you know. And it's time that it's time that we work together, rather, you know, whatever your opinion is, whatever your idea is, it's time that we do something with this. You know, and this, I don't know.
It's time to stop doing Chicken Little, the sky is falling.
Yeah, you know, and it's time to stop spreading stuff that you know is wrong on both sides. You know, on both sides there have been people that have the sky is falling, and you know, on the conservative as well as the liberal and the others and all the 18 other sides that there are. It's time to stop that, and it's time to see what we can do to help with this. Ultimately, I think it's going to have to be a divine intervention, and maybe it is. Maybe it is. Maybe,
This is a testing time.
you know, maybe the vaccine was a divine intervention. Maybe something else is a divine intervention. I don't know how I believe God is intervening. I don't know how. I don't know what the mechanisms are. But, you know, it's time for us to recognize that too, in whatever way that he's intervening. Or maybe this is one of his things where he's bringing some suffering on. I mean, I don't know. I have no idea. But our job as Christians, regardless of all of this, what's our job as Christians, regardless of any of this? Our job is to love God. Our job is to love our neighbor. Our job is to plant the seeds of the gospel. I don't know that you can get any better than that. Regardless of whether you think you need to mask up or not, regardless of whether you think the vaccine has microchips in it or not, regardless of whether you think that Fauci is the greatest guy in the world or the worst guy in the world, regardless of any of that, These are our jobs. Love God, love our neighbor, and plant the seeds of the gospel. That transcends, think about that, that transcends any of this other crud that's going on down here, doesn't it? Doesn't it?
You just need to have faith and do what he tells us.
And you keep going. You keep going until God says, that's enough.
It's time to go and meet Bob Parnell.
The thing we do know is that God's in control. We may not know anything else. We do know that.
Sometimes we wonder how, Gwen,
I know that.
you know,
Question that, but he is.
but we have to understand that. We have to understand that.